The great philosopher Aristotle was interested in defining what the best government was. Aristotle is one of the greatest philosophers in history. He lived uh, around the time of Alexander. He was tutor to Alexander the Great. And Aristotle wrote a book called The Politics, which is how a polis works. Politics is the uh, discipline that studies the operation of the state. And he actually had students, and he sent those students to different polis throughout Greece and to take notes. It's a research project to figure out what the different forms of government are. Aristotle loved categories, so he decided that forms of government, all forms of government in Greece could be grouped under three major categories: monarchy, aristocracy, and polity. Sometimes polity is translated as constitutional government, uh, but that's, I think, a anachronistic term. A monarchy is a state that is ruled by one man who inherits the power from his father and passes that power on to his son. Monarchies are usually, they exist with the consent, implicit consent of the people, and there are many instances of monarchies that are actually pretty good. Those, of course, had disappeared from Greece at this time. They existed in Macedonia and Thessaly, but the Greeks didn't consider those people actually real Greeks. Then you have aristocracy. Aristocracy is the rule of the best. That is a society where those who are the best members of society run the government. And of course, the best are usually considered those who belong to the noble families. They rule through councils, and that was actually the case in most Greek cities uh, before the development of democracy. Then you have a polity, and the polity is a system where there is a constitution, where there is a general tacit, I'm sorry, not tacit, where there's a general um, discussed agreement among the members of the community to create such type of government. Kind of a social contract, if you want to use a more modern term for that. The polity comes to into being through the common will of the citizens. From the year 500 BC on, we describe the period of history as classical Greece. That is the period in which they attain the highest expression in terms of their civilization. And this period, about 200 years, and it starts, it's difficult to say when it starts, but 500 is a good point. Uh, it ends with the death of Alexander the Great. This period uh, represents, as I said, the peak of the Hellenic civilization. After that, there will be something called Hellenistic civilization, which is the spread of this civilization to other places where it will blend with local currents. And during this time, there were two cities that dominated uh, the Greek world politically and culturally. One of them is Athens, and the other one is Sparta. And we'll talk about the Spartans today. The children are raised by their mother until the age of 7. I should say the boys. Girls stay with their mothers, but at the age of 7, boys go to the agoge, the training school. And the agoge has two phases. The first phase is from age 7 to around 13, and that's where the basic education takes place. They learn how to read and write, which is important, but that's about it in terms of academic training. The rest is just making them tough. Kids are given one cloak to wear the whole year, whether it's hot or whether it's cold. They have to walk barefoot, they sleep on the floor. They are treated in a very, very harsh manner. And they are given food, but it's enough to sustain them, that not enough so that they're always a little hungry. So the idea is to make them resourceful. They have to figure out how to get extra food. But if they get caught getting extra food, then they are punished brutally. It's a weeding out process. They're weeding out the weak and the dumb. They want the stronger people, the clever people, the resourceful people, the intelligent people to make it through this process. So the selection is not so much as when you are born. The selection happens when you go to the agoge. Because if you get left behind, you become a special category of people in Spartan society. You're neither a helot, nor a pericoid, nor a homoioi. You're someone who has failed, someone who was given the opportunity to be a Spartan, someone who was given the opportunity to be a homoioi and fail. There were many individuals like that in Spartan society, and they were looked at with contempt. So at the Agoge, these kids become tough. There's a legend, and that's what is represented on the image on the right, of a boy who was so hungry that he captured a little fox. And he was holding the fox because he was going to eat it later. So one of the trainers said to the boys, I know that someone has something, is hiding something. Please come forward and give it to me. So this boy uh, basically kept the fox under his cloak, and he did not flinch. He did not say, I took the fox. Now the little animal, vicious little animal, starts to gnaw into his abdomen, and then he basically goes inside and starts to eat his intestines. And the boy is just standing there. And at one point, of course, he starts to bleed and he dies. It's only a legend, of course. Most likely this didn't happen. But the legend was told to little boys to illustrate that you have to do whatever it takes to eat, even if it means breaking the rules. But once you break the rules, you basically adhere to the consequences. In this case, you don't say, I did it. You just take the pain and, in this case, die. An extreme story, of course, but it's to instill in these boys the idea of this dual relationship with rules, right? You have to follow all of these rules. But if you need to, you break them, but don't get caught. And if you get caught, you pay the consequences, but you don't admit it. It's a very strange mentality. And it must be very confusing also for a child to grow up like this. The Spartans also, during this period, learn that they are there for each other, that cohesiveness among the people who will later be part of the army is more important than family allegiances. The state is your father and mother. You owe allegiance to Sparta, not to your family. That's the whole point of separating them, because they grow up in this community that is tight. And we know from thousands of years of history that in war, what makes units successful, especially small units, is that cohesiveness that is developed among men. Around the age of 13, the boys, the ones who have made it, go on to the next stage. And during this stage, there's a more technical military training that takes place. They learn how to become proficient at using the spear, the shield, the sword. They practice archery. They practice how to fight as part of a phalanx, how to follow commands in the battlefield. And at this time, there's also something that is still controversial in terms of whether it actually happened or not. Each boy was given an advisor, an older man, and it is believed that a sexual relationship developed between the two, but that sexual relationship was supposed to end after a couple of years, and then it would become just a friendship. Uh, Again, this is in the ancient sources. We know that something similar happened in other Greek cities, but not as institutionalized as here. So there's still controversy as to whether there was an actual physical relationship or it was just like a mentor and mentee relationship. But this man is supposed to guide this young man, this teenager really, through the ropes, through the difficulty of making it in the Spartan world, which could be brutal. If you broke the rules and you were punished, you would be whipped. People would die during some of these punishments. uh, people would basically drop out. And if you are an agoge dropout, as I said before, you are someone who is the lowest of the low. You live there. They know you're there, and they kind of tolerate you, but you're not considered a real man. Sparta is more than a city. Sparta is an idea. Sparta is the city that defines the values of Greek civilization to the extreme. I mentioned before that one of the things that the Greeks valued tremendously was freedom, the notion of being free and independent from foreign rule. The idea of freedom in Greece is peculiar because freedom doesn't mean to do whatever you want. That's what barbarians do, right? They allow themselves to indulge into their desires and whims and whatever they want to do. Someone who lives in the Pontic steppe in a tent with a few horses, his family, and a herd of sheep, he might be free until someone else wants to take what he owns. Freedom does not mean to live out there disconnected from everyone else. Freedom, from the Greek point of view, can only exist within civilized society. Society offers you the possibility to be something more than just some individual trying to survive day by day. It gives meaning to your life. And therefore, freedom means limits on what you can do. Because if you don't have any limits, then anyone else can take away what is yours. Anyone else can uh, inflict an act of violence upon you. So that means that within society, you need rules, and those rules are what make you free. Uh, Today, you know that people cannot just, if they want, take away your property. That's They will be punished by the law. People cannot just break into your house and decide to live there. People cannot injure you because they will pay a price if they do. Uh, Freedom means that there are laws that protect us from each other. The limits that the law imposes upon me is what makes you free, and vice versa. The limits that the law imposes on you makes me free. And the question for the Greeks then, and by the way, all Greeks basically agree with that premise. The question for the Greeks is then, how many limitations are you willing to impose to accomplish this concept of freedom? And that's the key question to understand. And you will see later that the Athenians had a very different concept of what that meant. The Spartans, on the other hand, go to extremes. They regiment every aspect of society so that the well being of the commonwealth, the well being of the community, the well being of the collective is above individual well being. And that's their definition of what a free society is, because that will ensure that Sparta will be free from foreign rule. Very, very interesting notion. Here we see the ruins of Sparta. In the background, you see modern Sparta, which is a small modern town. And then right there, that little hole in the ground, that's what's left of Sparta. Not much. By looking at that, you would not think that Sparta is that incredibly important political entity in history, that the Spartans left an incredible mark that still affects us today. And you'll see why later. But they didn't live much. They didn't live a beautiful Parthenon like the Athenians. They didn't live beautiful statues. They even didn't even write philosophy or plays or history. They did produce poetry. There was this famous poet Terteus, but all he wrote about is the martial values of the Spartans. He wrote about war. He wrote about the ethical code of the Spartan warrior. So they did not produce uh, literature or history or sculpture or architecture, any of those things. And what is left is just those little markers of the dwellings where they lived. But their impact is going to be greater than what those ruins reflect, because they will create a concept. The concept of Sparta is greater than any building that you could have built. The concept of Sparta will be embedded into the political consciousness of the West, all the way to modern times. The Spartans were part of the Dorian invasion. Remember, these Dorians are Greeks who arrive a little later than the others, and they settle in the southern part of the Peloponnesus. The Peloponnesus is that big peninsula on the southern part of Greece. And the area where they settle is called Laconia or Lacedaemonia. They used both terms in ancient times. So the Laconians are the Spartans. The name of the country is Laconia, the territory. The name of the city is Sparta. But the term Sparta then came to signify the origin of these people. So these Dorians who became Spartans were not that different from the rest. They had similar traditions. They spoke the Dorian dialect of Greek. They worshipped the same gods as all the Greeks, and they were a warrior society like everyone else. At the beginning, they produced beautiful pottery. The crafts were encouraged. They had these beautiful choirs of women who sang songs that are probably religious in nature. Nothing seemed that different from the Spartans in comparison to other Greeks. But then they begin to expand. They start to conquer the rest of the Peloponnesus. So after pacifying Laconia, and pacifying means basically conquering, they invaded Arcadia, which at that point was considerably less developed area, and then they conquered Elis. By the way, all of these territories were mainly of Dorian Greek origin. When they conquered these territories, immediately they created two segments of society. At the top were the Spartans, and those who had been conquered were referred to as perioikoi, those who live around. And because they had been conquered, their status was lesser than the conquerors, the Spartans. And we'll see later how this will eventually affect the structure of Spartan society. Around 743 BC, the Spartans engaged in yet another war of conquest, the First Messenian War. The Messenia is to the west of Sparta, and you can see the area. It's like a peninsula. The Messenians had not yet achieved a high level of political organization, but they were Greeks, and they were not that different from the Spartans. They were also of Dorian origin. And as you can see, it took a while for them to conquer the country. And one of the problems that they had with Messenia is that in order to get to Messenia, they have to go around a range of mountains. So just arriving there was difficult. But they did. They conquered Messenia. And when they conquered Messenia, they imposed a different regime upon the conquered people. If you remember, the Perioikoi were the people who were conquering the other areas of the Peloponnesus. The Perioikoi were actually allowed to keep their autonomy in their towns. So even though they were subjected to Spartan rule, they continued to farm. They continued to mainly produce manufactured goods like pottery and weapons, uh, tools. They engaged in trade. So their lives didn't change that much, except that now they were subjects to the Spartans. In Messenia, and we don't know exactly why, the Spartans will take a very different approach. The Messenians will become serfs, and the term they used for them was helot. A helot is a Messenian who has been attached to an estate, and he's not a slave. It is not outright slavery, which existed in the rest of Greece. So they're not property, but they are subjected to a regime that limits them to an estate, and that estate belongs to Sparta, to the country of Sparta. So the condition of the Messenians was much harsher than the condition of the Perioikoi, even though they were both conquered peoples. Again, we don't know exactly why they decided upon that. Why did it make them uh, impose a much harsher regime? One hypothesis is that because Messenia was more difficult to access, it was more difficult to get to, they had to be harsher. They had to impose greater measures of control upon the population. And by the way, the other Greeks didn't look uh, with approval upon this, because even though slavery existed in ancient Greece, it existed individually. You capture people in war, they become slaves, you buy slaves. But this is different. A whole people being placed under a regime that is not exactly slavery, but it's not freedom either. You can obviously conclude that the Messenians were not happy. And we know that they revolted, and probably often. But in 1660, the revolt acquired very, very serious proportions. The Second Messenian War is really a rebellion on the part of the Helots against the Spartan state. And it lasts for about 10 years. And it had a traumatic effect upon the Spartans. Remember, up until this time, the Spartans were not that different from the rest of the Greeks, except for their territorial expansion. But this is going to change them. Why? Because they have to put in a lot of effort. They have to send in a lot of soldiers. It will take them 10 years to put down the revolt. And there's one basic problem here, and that is the problem of numbers. The Spartans had a relatively small population. The Messenians were more. There were many more Messenians than Spartans. And they understood, even though they won this war, that at one point the numbers would be so great that they would not be manageable. So they won, and they went back to think about what to do. So this is the reality that the Spartan state is facing. There are three categories of people in Sparta. The first one is the homoioi, or Spartiates. Those are the Spartans themselves. They are the only people who have the designation of citizens in the state. Homoioi, by the way, means equals, so they consider themselves equal to each other. They control the Spartan state. Under them, there's the Perioikoi. And by the way, there are only probably about 10,000 homoioi. That is 10,000 men of fighting age. Then you have the Perioikoi. And the Perioikoi are those who live around. That's what Perioikoi means. Those are the people that they conquered in places like Arcadia or Elis, the area around Sparta, Laconia. They live in their own towns. They have local autonomy. They actually are encouraged to produce goods and to trade. They are the ones who make the weapons of the Spartans. They are the ones who make the tools for the Spartans. They are the builders. And they also have to serve in the army, but their standards are not as high as that of the homoioi. So they're auxiliary troops. And there are probably about, according to some calculations, 50, 75,000 of them. Again, we're only counting males of fighting age. And then you have the Helots in Messenia. And the Helots are serfs. They are peasants attached to the land who live under the constant supervision of Spartans. There are probably 125,000 of those, according to some calculations. The number of homoioi is pretty clear. We know that it's around 10,000 throughout this period. The other numbers we know that are much greater. And that represents a fundamental problem for the Spartans, because they know that as time goes by, the numbers of their people who are not equals will just multiply, and that will be problematic for them. So what do? Well, like many other cities at this time, they go to someone who has a reputation for being intelligent, for being wise. and for being someone who can be trusted. So they find a lawgiver. Lawgivers were an old tradition in Greek cities. The person that the Spartans go to is a man by the name of Lycurgus. We know very little about Lycurgus. We have many references, we have biographies of him written in ancient times, but these are not firsthand, and there's still many question marks about him. Some people place him around the year 800 something BC, others around the year 700. 750 BC is a good guess as to when he may have lived. Some people even doubt that he existed. Some people think that he's the product of legend. But most historians believe that there was a Lycurgus, and he had a fundamental role in defining the Spartan system. We know that he had traveled to many places, especially he traveled to the island of Crete, which had been invaded by Dorians. And he looked at some of these structures that they had there, and that gave him some ideas. So he's now in Sparta, and the Spartans say, Lycurgus, we trust you. Can you give us a constitution? That is, can you create a state that will enable us to function, given the conditions that we have, right? This very interesting segmentation of homoioi, periokoi, and helots. And Lycurgus says, fine. So according to tradition, Lycurgus put together a Spartan constitution. So he is considered the father of or the author of the Spartan constitution, which is also known as the Great Rhetra. The Rhetra means proclamation. So the great proclamation of the system. According to, and again, we don't know whether it was actually Lycurgus who did it, but that is what the ancient tradition accepts. Very interesting system. Remember that every other Greek city-state had eliminated monarchy. At one point they had kings, but those disappear, and sometimes they even preserve the title of a king for a special ceremonial position, but no other city was ruled by kings. In Sparta, not only is there a monarchy, but they have two kings. And the kings have some real authority. They are considered the embodiment of the state. They are the heads of state, and they're also the commanders of the army. Why two kings? Because once upon a time there was a conflict between two families, and rather than having a civil war, they agreed to have two kings. But the kings are not the most powerful position in the state. That is reserved to the Gerousia. The Gerousia is the center of political power. It is composed by the two kings plus 28 elders, men who are at least 60 years old. It's a council of elders, really. And these elders come from a group of families that go all the way back to the aristocratic period of Sparta. If an elder dies, he is replaced by another one that is selected by the members of the Gerousia. So they decide who is a member of this body. And this is the most important body in Sparta because they are the ones who make the laws, they are the ones who declare war, they are the ones who make peace treaties. All the important decisions of the Spartan state are made by the Gerousia. Every year, 5 ephors are elected by the citizens. The ephors are, in a sense, the executive power. They carry out the day-to-day business of government. And after the end of the 1 year that they serve, they go automatically on trial to make sure that they were honest. And then you have the appella. The appella is the assembly of all homoioi, the assembly of all citizens. The role of the appella is to either ratify, that is, approve, or reject the decisions of the Gerousia. So once the Gerousia makes a decision, it is put to a vote in the appella, and they can vote yes or no. Since the Spartans are so obedient to authority, there is no evidence that the appella ever said no to anything. But still, it had the power to do so. Now, who is a citizen? A citizen is a Spartan of Spartan parents who has gone through the training, who is a member of the army, and who is at least 30 years old. That's a Spartan citizen. As you can see, it is a very complex system. It's unlike any other system. and it is very difficult to place under any categories. But of course, the Greeks, being also philosophers and scholars, looked at it and studied it and tried to figure out what it was. The most significant reform of the Spartan system is not the government, it's not the institutions that rule society, but is the way of life that they decide to adopt. And this is one of the most radical, perhaps the most radical social experiments in history. A whole society deciding that they will engage in a new project to rebuild every aspect of life. It starts with birth, actually starts before birth. In ancient societies, marriage was arranged by families. The family of the bride and the family of the groom would get together, they would make an agreement, and the couple would get married. Not in Sparta. In Sparta, couples are matched by the state, usually according to looks. The Spartans want to produce the best possible soldiers, and this is the idea behind all of this. Sparta is a minority. Spartans are a minority ruling over this large number of unhappy people. If they are going to be successful, according to Lycurgus, they have to be the best warriors possible. So, one of the aims of the Spartan state is to produce these super warriors, these superior warriors, that no matter how few their number is, they will still be able to overcome their enemies. So, it starts with the matching process of the couple. Strong